Hello dear friends, this is Ruslan Bailov once again, and you are watching the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front. Well, the fighting continues, and we continue to study the situation together. So my friends, only yesterday we went into great detail about what's happening in Pokrovsk. And yet, here we are again, returning to this city. Because over the past 24 hours, Russian forces have advanced even deeper inside the city. And not just anywhere, but in some of the toughest areas that serve as strongholds for the armed forces of Ukraine. Yes, there are still places where the AFU is putting up fierce resistance in Pokrovsk. Though, to be honest, there are very few left. One of them is the meat processing plant in the eastern part of the city, just south of the village of Rovnoy. Russian units already tried to enter that area earlier, but without success. The Ukrainian defensive line there still holds, for now. However, the territory of the meat processing plant itself, and you understand what that means, any industrial site by definition becomes a fortified defensive node. Since entering from the main road toward Rovnoy didn't work, the troops decided to act from another direction. They moved along the railway tracks, or rather beside them, and then entered the plant from the south. The fighting didn't last long, and now this stronghold is under Russian control. And what does that mean? It means the next settlement, Rovnoye, should get ready. Those factory buildings will definitely be used to accumulate infantry, and from there to Rovnoye, it's less than 500 meters, with no serious defensive lines in between. Why is Rovnoye important? Because this is not just one, but two villages, Rovnoy and Svetloye, lying between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. If Russian troops take Rovnoy and then Svetloye, that's it. The full blockade of Myrnohrad will become a reality. That's exactly why the AFU are desperately holding this area. Or, more precisely, trying to. Heavy fighting also continues in the last multi-story residential district still under Ukrainian control. But yesterday, footage appeared. Very telling footage, by the way, filmed from the Ukrainian side. In those videos, Russian infantry can be seen in the southern part of Pokrovsk, near those apartment blocks. What's striking is how relaxed they look. They walk calmly, not even glancing at the sky. That footage says one thing: Ukrainian drones can no longer inflict serious, sustained damage in the southern part of the city. That's why Russian soldiers feel relatively safe there. Secondly, this also shows that the clearing of southern Pokrovsk is complete. Every building has been checked, residents have been evacuated, and no attacks are expected from anywhere. That's why the troops are now operating with confidence and calm. And third, thanks to this stabilization, Russian forces have begun bringing in armored vehicles into the city. Yes, you heard that right. Practically the entire city, about 85%, was captured by infantry alone. Now that enemy drones have been pushed back, armor is being brought in, which will strengthen the offensive potential even further. As I mentioned yesterday, the final battles are underway for the Dinas residential district, and the AFU are losing ground fast. Over the last 24 hours, Russian troops advanced around 700 meters through the residential area, took control of 7 apartment buildings, and reached the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian-held area has now shrunk to a small rectangle, roughly 400 by 450 meters. Clearly, they won't be able to hold this pocket for long, maybe 2 or 3 more days at most, and then all those buildings will come under Russian control. And what follows? Only the private housing sector in the northern part of the city, where the AFU simply cannot mount serious resistance. A small part of the industrial zone remains contested, but once that's cleared, Pokrovsk will be fully under Russian control. By the way, as a result of Russian forces reaching the northern edge of Dinas, the exit corridor, the so-called neck, has narrowed from 2 kilometers and 250 meters down to exactly 2 kilometers. The difference might seem small, but every meter reduces the AFU's chances of escaping from the Myrnohrad pocket. Meanwhile, in Myrnohrad itself, fighting remains at a relatively low intensity. Clashes are happening, yes, but no one is forcing the pace. And that makes sense. Why rush? Once Pokrovsk is completely captured, the cauldron will close automatically, and the AFU will have no option but to surrender. So there's no reason to push forward and take unnecessary losses. Better to wait. some Ukrainian soldiers still have enough sense to see what's coming. For example, the day before yesterday, part of the 68th AFU Brigade surrendered. A very wise decision. They saved their lives. As for those who refuse, well, you understand what happens next. They stay in Pokrovsk forever. But it's not only in Pokrovsk that things are going badly for the AFU. The situation is also deteriorating in another city, Constantinovka. While everyone's attention is focused on Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, Russian forces continue to expand their control zone there as well. They advanced another 650 meters along Trudovaya, Internationalnaya, Alexander Ostrovsky, and Donetskaya streets. Why is this advance important? Because from these new positions, it's now only 650 meters to the railway station. If Russian troops manage to secure it, that would be a major strategic gain. However, as I've said before, don't expect a collapse like in Pokrovsk. The situation here is different. The main supply road is still open, and there isn't full drone control over the area. That road remains the main supply artery, so the AFU can still reinforce their troops in the city, which will make this battle much harder. Konstantinovka is large, the biggest urban area Russia has had to storm since Mariupol. For now, the AFU continue to lose ground gradually, and the main urban battles, if the war continues, will likely unfold in the spring or summer of 2026. And one more thing, let's not forget about Seversk. Remember, I told you earlier that Russian troops entered the southern part of the city along the railway and even secured positions there. But so far, there hasn't been much further progress for understandable reasons. There are 2 supply roads into the city, and while drones partially monitor them, there's still no full control. So the city remains supplied, for now. The front lines are close to cutting those roads, though, about 2 kilometers on either side. On one flank, Russian units could move through Zvanovka and seize Sviatopokrovskoye. On the other, advance from Dronovka toward Platonovka. Once that happens, the roads will be cut, and Seversk will face the same fate as Myrnohrad, complete encirclement, with no route for retreat. For the moment, however, the AFU are still holding their defensive lines there, which is why there hasn't yet been a full-scale storming of Seversk. Moving on, what else can be said about the front? There has been good progress by the Vostok group, about 5 kilometers forward, with 2 settlements captured, Uspanovka and Sladkoye. Objective control footage from Uspanovka confirms 100% that the town is fully under Russian control. Interestingly, Ukrainian sources themselves admit that Russian troops have advanced even farther west in this direction, meaning the fighting for Gulyai Pole is rapidly approaching. Ukrainian channels also report Russian reconnaissance groups appearing near Pokrovskoye, and yesterday there were reports of Russian presence in Alexandrovka. And that's the situation on the front lines for today. Ukrainian army desertions in October 2025, a new record. October 2025 has officially broken all previous records. During this month alone, 2,185 servicemen deserted from the armed forces of Ukraine. Since the beginning of the year, the total number of runners has reached 182,940, and since the start of the war, 306,072 people. To understand the scale of this disaster for the AFU, for the first time ever, this number has exceeded the 20,000 mark in a single month. Considering that almost no one ever returns, this means an instant -4 full brigades, and in reality, even more. Because rear service personnel rarely desert, these are almost entirely infantrymen, the very troops the AFU is catastrophically short of. In other words, this is the kind of loss you would normally expect only after months of fighting in a major battle. And if we take the total of 306,000, that's nearly half the number of Russian troops currently operating in Ukraine under the Russian armed forces. Moreover, all these are irretrievable losses, but without counting the dead. In simple terms, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers who could have been killed by this army are still alive today. And the 300,000 deserters on the other side are also alive, mostly healthy and out of the war. All in all, excellent news from this particular front. As Ukrainian soldiers themselves sometimes say in such cases, keep it up. Now let's talk about politics. Kiev seems intent on dragging out this war to the bitter end. Against the backdrop of the worsening frontline situation, mobilization problems, and a collapsing economy, this has given rise to a flood of rumors that we'll discuss next, reported by the Telegram channel Legitimny. For example, many sources say that the situation on the front is in fact catastrophic. Prolonging the war, they warn, risks leading to total capitulation, an act many call a national crime. Increasing numbers of officers and servicemen are suggesting that Zelensky is deliberately dragging out the conflict and quietly surrendering territory. Allegedly, there's some sort of backroom deal behind it all, hidden under the packaging of national interests. The government, they say, is deliberately inflating its negotiation demands in order to prolong the war until the desired territorial outcomes are achieved. Meanwhile, Zelensky is using this time to purge all those who are inconvenient or disloyal, exploiting the war for personal and political gain. Foreign analysts are beginning to acknowledge that the northern salient near Shakovo and Zolotoy Kolodez, which formed shortly before the encirclement of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, played a decisive role in the city's capture. Its purpose was simple: to stretch the front line and force the AFU to disperse their forces. As a result, General Seversk didn't have enough reserves to redeploy under Pokrovsk and disrupt the Russian advance. Instead of focusing on holding Pokrovsk, Seversk reacted to the Russian breakthrough toward Dobropilya, and that was his mistake. Interestingly, the so-called media meme brigades, like the 3rd Assault Brigade and other highly publicized units, never appeared under Pokrovsk. Our source reports that there is no funding available for Zelensky's new financial initiative within the mobilization framework. Zelensky had planned to grant everyone, even those already serving, the right to sign new contracts. That would require billions of dollars in instant payouts. He hoped Europe would cover those costs, but the globalists, as it turns out, refused. They don't want to pay. They just demand more conscription raids. It's cheaper that way. Moreover, they no longer believe this system will work. The source adds that globalist circles are increasingly dissatisfied with how costly and heavy the Ukrainian project has become and are demanding budget cuts. But there are so many problems that there's practically nothing left to cut. In addition, Zelensky continues his so-called infrastructure war 3.0, despite repeated warnings about the consequences. It will result in Ukrainians being left without electricity, water, or heating. The AFU recently attacked the Volgorechynsk thermal power plant in the Kostroma region, a facility supplying electricity to more than 40 regions of central Russia. However, the strike failed to achieve its goal. There was no mass blackout. They also struck Crimea, targeting energy infrastructure and fuel storage facilities. In response, Russian forces hit the Ukrainian railway network that's currently being used to move reinforcements toward the Pokrovsk pocket. The Russian aerospace forces continue hunting for trains. The situation will only worsen. This winter, Ukrainians will face up to 15 hours a day without power, and heating will be available only to a select few. Meanwhile, Zelensky has issued an ultimatum to Brussels: no partial membership. Kiev is categorically against joining the European Union on a trial basis. Ukraine demands full membership only. That's what the head of the Kiev regime, Vladimir Zelensky, stated, commenting on the new proposals currently being discussed in Brussels. If we're talking about EU membership, it must be complete, Zelensky said. It's very important that all countries sit at one table as equals, that they share the same values. In my opinion, you can't be a half-member or semi-active participant of the EU, he said, as quoted by the Ukrainian outlet Strana. To recall, the European Union is considering introducing a probationary period for new members to ensure that they don't turn into another Hungary, meaning a state that contradicts EU policy after joining. This was stated by the EU Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos. This trial period could last several years and would include the possibility of expelling a member state if it deviates from democratic principles. I don't want to be known as the commissioner who brings in Trojan horses that will act up in 5, 10, or 15 years, Kos emphasized. Finally, Asia Times writes that Donald Trump has openly acknowledged the era of the unipolar world order is over. After meeting with China's President Xi Jinping, Trump triumphantly declared, "My meeting with Chairman Xi Jinping at the G20 was very important for both of our countries. This meeting will lead to lasting peace and prosperity. May God bless both China and the United States. This statement is historic. For the first time, an American president publicly used the term G2, signaling not just a normalization of relations with China, but an official recognition at the highest level that the unipolar world order, long dominated by the United States, has come to an end. Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong had earlier said, "The old rules no longer apply, and the new ones have not yet been written." While the United States remains a great power, its ability, and sometimes its will, to shape global initiatives is no longer guaranteed. America is retreating from its role as the world's guarantor, and no one else can take its place. Trump's statement is more than mere diplomatic optimism. It represents a philosophical break from decades of U.S. foreign policy, a policy that viewed China solely as a rival, a threat, or a challenge to the Western world order. Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong had earlier said, "The old rules no longer apply, and the new ones have not yet been written." While the United States remains a great power, its ability, and sometimes its will, to shape global initiatives is no longer guaranteed. America is retreating from its role as the world's guarantor, and no one else can take its place. Trump's statement is more than mere diplomatic optimism. It represents a philosophical break from decades of U.S. foreign policy, a policy that viewed China solely as a rival, a threat, or a challenge to the Western world order. Thank you for watching, my friends. Stay strong, stay informed, and take care of yourselves. See you in the next report. This is Ruslan Beylov, signing off.